China and Russia are as close as ever, and that's the problem for the US. Chinese leader Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin at the Diaoyutai State Guest House in Beijing, China on February 4th, 2022. Hong Kong CNN. When Anthony Blinken makes the expected trip to Beijing in the coming days for what would be the first visit to China by the US Secretary of State since 2018, he will be cutting a stark contrast to the scene in the Chinese capital 1 year earlier. Then Chinese leader Xi Jinping welcomed the Russian President Vladimir Putin for the opening of the Beijing Olympics, meeting for talks and dinner in Putin's honor, and declared a no-limit partnership between the two neighbors. Weeks later, as Russian tanks rolled across the border into Ukraine, starting an invasion that would devastate the country and cause the humanitarian crisis, Chinese leaders did not shrink from that declaration. Though Beijing claimed impartiality in the conflict and no advance knowledge of Russia's intent, it also refused to condemn Moscow. Instead, it parroted Kremlin lines blaming NATO for provoking the conflict, further fracturing relationship with both Europe and the US. A year on, the contrast of the Blinken visit would be no coincidence. Economically drained by its now abandoned zero COVID strategy, Beijing has been softening its tone on foreign affairs and upping its diplomacy with the Western government. Analysts say it a bid to win back lost ground and stabilize its relations. In meetings with Blinken during his expected early February trip, as well as European leaders who've signaled, signaled they may visit in the coming months, Chinese counterparts are likely to emphasize their long-standing calls for a peaceful resolution and play up what they claim is China's objective and impartial position in the conflict, analysts say. But while the optics may be different from this time last year, China's support for Russia, when measured by its annual trade, diplomatic engagement, and schedule of joint military exercises, tells a different story. Those met those metrics show that over the past year, China has continued to bolster, not retreat from its no-limit partnership, a relationship that has been strengthening in recent years and which analysts say Beijing continues to view as key to its fundamental goals of maintaining national security and pushing back at the US-led world order. China is very skilled in calibrating the narrative depending on the audience, said Alexander Gabuev, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. But when it comes to China's ties with Russia in the wake of the Ukraine war, I don't see any buyer's remorse. Rather, he added, China is helping itself to the opportunities that crisis provides. Retired colonel has a theory about why suspected Chinese spy balloon is over Montana. Global partner. Since the early days of the war in Ukraine, US President Joe Biden's administration has warned the Chinese government of potential subsequences for any material support for Putin's invasion. US intelligence officials have consistently said they have not seen evidence China provided letter aid to Russia, but the US recently raised concerns with China about evidence suggesting state-owned Chinese companies had sold Russia non-lethal equipment, a charge Beijing vehe- vehemently denies. While a handful of Chinese companies have been placed on U.S. blacklist in connection with the conflict, most have appeared to calibrate their business to still steer clear of violating the extensive sanctions unleashed by the US and its allies against Moscow. Beijing has long stressed that it seeks to play a constructive role towards the peaceful resolution of the conflict, and during a September meeting, Putin conceded Beijing has had raised the questions and concerns about the crisis. Yet China has continued to expand the trade with its northern neighbor, opening for the first time two permanent bridges to facilitate the trade over a key border river and drumming up a record 1.28 trillion yuan, $190 billion last year, according to Chinese data released last month. That marked an increase of around 30% from 2021, driven in part by Chinese companies snapping up discounted oil and coal, even as other governments moved to shun Russian fuel, shouldering mounting energy prices to avoid financing Russia. Russia's invasion of Ukraine revealed the limits of Russia China relations. She congratulated Putin on the boosted trade numbers during a customary talk end of year talk between the two leaders, where he also called for the two countries to enhance strategic coordination and continue to be each other's development opportunity and global partner. The talks, the talk conducted over video link in December was one of at least four sets of conversations, including one face-to-face meeting between Xi and Putin since the start of the war. She has yet to speak to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky during that time, though the Ukrainian leader has publicly expressed interest. Meanwhile, the security relationship between China and Russia has raised concern among America's Asian allies. In recent months, China has sent more than 2,000 personnel into Russia for the joint drill, dispatched its strategic warplanes for patrols alongside Russia's over the Sea of Japan and the East China Sea, and deployed a number of vessels for week-long live-fire joint naval exercises in waters near Japan. On Tuesday, Chinese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and visiting NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg voiced concerns over Russia's growing military cooperation with China, including joint operations and drills in the vicinity of Japan in the meeting in Tokyo, according to their joint statement. But even as those engagements, as well as its flourishing trade and diplomacy, may have elevated worries about the China-Russia relationship in the West, they remain a foundation for China's overall foreign policy, in which Russia also plays a key role bolstering China's influence at the UN, according to Yan Pierre Cabestan, an emeritus professor at Hong Kong Baptist University's Department of Government and International Studies. The relationship with Russia prevails in terms of China's external interest because it's aimed against the United States and the United States' alliance systems, both in Europe and in Asia, he said. China's main objective is to weaken those alliance systems. Technicians inspect the natural gas pipeline connected to Russia at the gas distributing station in northern China's Hebei province in November 2022. Trump offensive. While the importance of each Russian relationship may not have changed, China has made the effort to dial down its overall rhetoric towards the West and revamp its diplomacy, analysts say, as it pushes for economic recovery following one of its worst annual economic performances in nearly half a century. The overwhelming priority for China is economic recovery, and the economic recovery requires not having a destabilizing relationship with the United States, said Yon Sun, director of the China program at the Stimson Center think tank in Washington. That's contributing to this charm offensive, she said, adding that this is more likely a short term maneuver as China seeks to recover its faltering growth, not a fundamental revision of Beijing's assertive foreign policy. Western governments will be carefully watching this tone shift and diplomatic outreach, and whether it has any potential impact on the war in Ukraine. For Blinken, who is expected to arrive in China on the heels of a relatively amicable face to face between Biden and Xi at the Group of 20 in November, the Ukraine war is expected to be one of the several key issues of focus during the visit. Biden described what he discussed with Xi Jinping in G20 meeting. The secretary will likely repeat past America warnings about supporting the Russian war effort, but may also look to scope out any potential for Beijing to influence Moscow towards the peace, analysts say. This has been a line of thinking in Europe, where leaders like French President Emmanuel Macron, who is also expected to visit China in the coming months, have expressed hope for Beijing to assume such a role. But analysts are skeptical China is very carefully feeding these misconceptions that it could influence Putin over the war, something Beijing likely has little confidence it could do, according to Carnegie Endowment Gabweb. While managing expectations, China could look to parlay this perception to get some goodwill, but Beijing will still remain well aware that the root of tensions and challenges in its relationship with Western powers run far deeper than concerns over its rapport with Russia, he said. That means the expectations that China could help the West to resolve the conflict, an outcome China too has called for, are likely to meet the limit at Beijing's bottom line. As Sun put it, you will never see a scenario where China abandons Russia because in China's dictionary, if Russia stands to fall, China is next.